Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, I'm delighted to welcome you at the episode number 41 of our series of conversations and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine and abroad. For those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. Я рада вітати вас на 41-му епізоді нашої серії бесід та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні та за кордоном. Для тих, хто прагне дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути з перших джерел. Yesterday, on February 24th, we marked 365 days of Ukrainian resistance against Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 1 year of full-scale war. Russia's barbaric war against Ukraine has created the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since the Second World War, disrupted the food supply to some of the world's most vulnerable nations, and has threatened European and world peace. This war threatened all the world. Yesterday's rally only in London gathered up to 10,000 people and had massive support of local media communities and politicians. But it's still not enough, and this is sadly not the universal case. Ukraine continues to fight for freedom and will fight as long as it takes to win, because in the face of Russia, genocidal aggression, there is no choice but to win. Вчора, 24 лютого, ми відзначили 365 днів українського опору проти незаконного та непровокованого повномасштабного вторгнення Росії в Україну. 1 рік повномасштабної війни. Ця варварська війна спричинила найбільшу гуманітарну кризу в Європі з часів Другої світової війни. Порушує постачання продовольства до деяких найбільш вразливих країн світу, про які ми сьогодні також поговоримо, та поставило під загрозу європейський та світовий мир. Ця війна загрожує цілому світові. Вчорашній мітинг лише у Лондоні зібрав орієнтовно до 10 тисяч людей і мав масову підтримку місцевих засобів масової інформації, громад та політиків. Та цього все ще недостатньо, і це не універсальний світовий контекст. Україна продовжує боротися за свободу і буде боротися стільки, скільки буде потрібно для перемоги. Бо перед обличчям російської геноцидної агресії у нас немає іншого вибору, окрім як перемогти. One of those who stands at the front line of freedom of expression fight is PEN Ukraine, the main organizer of the project, and it is co-hosted by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and our traditional partners, in America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Серед тих, хто не покладає руку боротьбі за свободу слова, головний організатор проєкту «Діалоги» – Український центр ПЕН. Співорганізатором є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. Проект втілюється за підтримки Посольства США в Україні і наших традиційних партнерів – ПЕН Америка, Українського інституту Лондона, Україна Світ, Локальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та Інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. Захід відбувається англійською мовою. And I'll switch to English to introduce myself and our today's guests. My name is Olha Mukha and I work for PEN International, but being proud to be a member of PEN Ukraine as well. And I'm delighted to introduce our today's guests. Both are strictly linked with Africa. And I do hope today we will get a lot of insights at that topic we barely had a chance to touch in our previous episodes. I'm delighted to introduce Oksana Rozumna. Beside being a diplomat, first of all, she's a poet and author of children's books. Oksana has been living in Pretoria for the last 5 years and participating in South African literature festivals and anthologies. After obtaining her PhD in religious studies, she worked at the Parliamentary Committee for Culture National Institute for Strategic Studies, and then Ukrainian diplomat to South Africa since 2018. Her research and cultural diplomacy, as well as the development of cultural diplomacy institutions, gave her a lot of expertise in the topics we would like to hear as well. Oksana launched and curated the project I'll Be Waiting for You under the KAIS draft, I do hope I pronounce it that well, to translate African contemporary poetry into Ukrainian. In collaboration with folk and contemporary dance theater, she developed the narrative on internal refugees and global migration. Also very important topics which gives us some outlook from the Ukrainian perspective nowadays. So, therefore, Oksana's interest in Africa isn't limited by diplomacy, but embraced wider cultural context, which allows us to discuss more questions. And Oksana will hold her conversation today with Peter Godwin, the award-winning author of The Fear, When a Crocodile Eats the Sun, and Mukha, all published by Picador. He writes for various publications, including the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, and Vanity Fair. Peter was born and raised in Zimbabwe, later studied law at Cambridge University and international relations at Oxford, and later on, practicing human rights law in Zimbabwe, he became a foreign correspondent, reporting from more than 60 countries, including conflicts in Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Somalia, and I will not provide you with a whole list because we'll run out of our time. He served also as the East European correspondent and diplomatic correspondent for the London Sunday Times and chief correspondent for BBC Television. I just started your three-part series for Britain's Channel 4 Africa Unmasked, and it's terrifying, Peter. Thank you so much for doing such projects. And Peter is also a great PEN fellow. He served as PEN America president. So I'm really delighted to have you two here with us. Thank you so much for your time and commitment and ready to learn something completely new. You definitely have those insights to share. So dear viewers, please send me your questions or leave them in comments as usually. And I'm passing the stage to our guests and ready to enjoy. Thank you. Peter?
Hi, it's good to be here. Thank you for the introduction. I really wanted to start just by asking Oksana if we've just obviously passed the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, what your thoughts are on this occasion, how you feel, what your state of mind is on this anniversary.
Hello, everyone. Good day, Peter. I would like to start with the words of gratitude. First of all, I want to thank PEN organization. During this year, it's been a year of tremendous challenges for all of us, and PEN Ukraine, they work really like a team of rescuers, saving lives, saving souls, saving libraries, supporting families. It's really very important in this situation, and PEN has a good networking across the world. I know this because I participate in project People from Empty Chairs, and I know how is it supportive activity of expressing solidarity from other country. And I thank you, Peter, for coming to Ukraine last December and for being with us, with our people for a while. This year, it changed all of us. And as Olha mentioned, I spent this year in South Africa, working for my country as a diplomat and witnessing the changes in South African society towards Ukrainian people, and as well witnessing the position of government and how the conversation between grassroots organization, Ukrainian and South African develop, and how I can say that during this year we really started a new page. We really started a new stage of dialogue between Global South countries, between South Africa and Ukraine. And it's been fascinating, this dialogue, despite the neutrality, so-called neutrality of the government of South Africa. And you probably know about the current situation when South Africa allowed the Navy drills together with Russia and China on the very days of any Ukrainian, the saddest days in Ukrainian calendar. It's anniversary of the war. A wave of protests, we're witnessing a wave of protests during recent week in South Africa. We have very strong Ukrainian community organization, Ukrainian Association in South Africa, who organized together with grassroots organization a lot of events to support Ukraine, to protest against the government position of neutrality. So it's a year of huge changes, and I remember well how until the beginning of this war, how it was in media of South Africa. They hardly noticed Ukraine in their news feed, but just before a week before the war, the more and more news came up, the more and more the deeper and deeper interest from the media to our country. I remember well how they started to call Ukraine with no Article V, how they started to how they understood that Ukrainian language, it's not a Russian language, that we are two separate nations. So maybe you noticed as well a lot of changes, and the recent visits of Lavrov to South Africa and of Lukashenko to Zimbabwe, they quite a lot interesting as well, and maybe you can comment. And I suppose we are expected to find some keys to brainstorm this topic, Ukraine and support of Western countries to Ukraine, and misunderstanding between Western and African rhetoric. Maybe you can find some keys to this subject as well.
Yeah, it struck me at the beginning of the conflict that the global South, but Southern Africa in particular, when they took a position that seemed to be more pro-Russian, or as you say, strictly neutral, but seemed to be pro-Russian to some extent, was based on the history of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, where Russia and to some extent China had both supported liberation movements, guerrilla movements, including the ANC, and in Zimbabwe, actually ZAPU rather than Mugabe, but who was supported by China. But that either way, those countries were seen to support, to have supported the struggle for independence in South Africa, and therefore there was this historic tie. They had educated quite a lot of Black Southern Africans at universities in the Soviet Union in the old days, and there were some connections. And it interested me to see that position, which was sort of, if you were, the default historical pose, because what it seemed to me to obfuscate is that actually what you were seeing with the breakup of the Soviet Union and with this particular struggle between Russia and Ukraine, with the invasion of Ukraine, was actually something that was in itself colonial, and that if you were going to draw an analogy, then Ukraine was struggling for its independence against the old colonial power, namely Russia, and that in that regard, Southern Africans and the ANC government in particular should have much more sympathy inherently, historically, with your position, with the position of Ukraine.
Yes, in this regard, I contemplate a lot about this during that year. I think that it's time to discrown the Soviet Union. Maybe it sounds strange now, but how the Africans say now the danger of a single story. So they know only a single story about Soviet Union, a story of country liberator, but they don't know other sides of their story. What was behind Soviet Union? What was this regime like? And I see a lot of I wouldn't say parallels, but I see a lot of things to speak that apartheid, the policy of apartheid, has so many similar with Soviet regime, and I would speak about this now. But how to start this conversation? Because Africans, they have so idyllic image of Soviet Union, and maybe. It's the only their only understanding that Soviet Union helped to struggle against imperialism, but at the same time we started to explain that Soviet Union was not represented just by Russia. Soviet Union was a union of 15 republics, and it was to speak as well that not only about the title nations of these 15 republics, but of course about other nationalities. They populated Soviet Union, like Crimean Tatars, Jews, Lithuanian, Polish, Bulgarian, Greek, a lot of communities only on the territory of Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine and contemporary Ukraine. And all these people impacted in this struggle for liberation. But at the same time, Soviet Union, it's a country with a lot of human rights, was a country with a lot of human rights violations. All this policy, like policy of forced displacement, for example, oppression from the Russian to other nationalities. So even this war, it was predicted by previous generations of Ukrainians, because during Soviet Union, other nationalities were oppressed. So it seems to me it's the only key now to speak to Global South. It's the only key to discrown Soviet Union, to tell more, to tell how many sides had this story, how many things were in the shadow of this story.
Yes,
is it possible? Is it possible in general?
It seems to me that you have it's quite a big job. I mean, because essentially you have to. It's not about, it's about reframing something that was framed in a different way. And it's like there are two parts to it. There's the history to it, which you've just very fluently described, and how the fact, I mean, I would just add that, you know, the struggle against imperialism during the Cold War was basically, the way that it played out in Africa was almost a reflex, insofar as whichever country Washington supported, Moscow supported the other side, and vice versa. I mean, there's a wonderful example of Somalia, where Siad Barre changed back between them, you know, just to get more aid and more weapons. He would play them off against each other. And to that extent, the liberation of Africa from the point of view of the USSR wasn't a great struggle against imperialism. It was a struggle against the US. It was an integral part of the Cold War. There's the reframing of that, and also the reframing of, as you were saying, the identity of the Soviet Union. But even though there were 15 republics, that it was dominated by Russia. It was a project that was very much a Russian project, and in that sense, it could be seen as, I mean, what we're really seeing, it seems to me, is in these conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe, is the breakup of an empire, and that there's always so much volatility when an empire breaks up. I mean, I think that we sometimes don't notice it on the ground where the energy and the volatility is coming from in conflicts. And I think, for example, we've been seeing it to some extent in Ethiopia recently, where you're sort of seeing a composite empire starting to break up. But in that sense, your job, I suppose, is to try and reframe Ukraine's struggle as a liberation struggle, and that's something, in a sense, that the South African leadership would naturally have much more in common with than Moscow's point of view.
Yes, it's about the perception by Africans. Yes. African nations, and how to build this bridge between Ukraine and Africa, and how to struggle with Russian propaganda in Africa. And it's we need to show how to what can Russia bring here to South Africa, except their lie and propaganda, except Wagner troops, except I even don't know. It seems to me that Global South is now in focus of Russian foreign policy, because Western countries are fed up with Russian propaganda, and now Russia is feeding Global South with it, telling different stories, and how to show to Global South that all this stuff is toxic. Propaganda is toxic. It's better. What is better for Africa, for example? Which way?
And how have you been? I'm curious to know, how have you been fighting back? What have you been able to do? What have your how have you been able to? How are you trying to counter that on the ground?
We just started this. We didn't have tradition of proper conversation with African country. We spoke only through mediators, through Western countries, or through in frame of Soviet propaganda. We never had dialogue, open dialogue with African countries. And it seems to me it's very sad, and it's very pessimistic, and it seems to me that a very long way ahead. But frankly, it's now every single story is about Africa and is about Global South. Maybe I exaggerate, but when we started the project of translation of African poetry into Ukrainian, this project very, very quickly switched to project about refugees, Ukrainian internal refugees and African refugees. And telling the story of Ukrainian refugee it's the same important as telling the story on African refugees. And for us, as for writers, researchers, journalists, just telling simple human stories, it seems to me it's the first thing we need to do on the level of culture, on the level of literature, because of course we are highly interested now in voting in United Nations, in votes from Africa, but at the same time I feel the danger of this frame, just political dialogue. It seems to me it needs to be much larger on the level of human stories.
Right, and I mean certainly the refugee experience is one way to reach out to show a commonality of experience. Although, I mean, even there, I guess there is the question, which I'd be curious to see how you've dealt with it, where there was some criticism earlier on that from African nations that Ukrainian refugees who were mostly or exclusively white were, when they were fleeing from Ukraine after the Russian invasion, were generally met with an open door in Europe, especially Poland, but elsewhere, and that it was much more difficult for African refugees to get in. I'm curious, how did that dialogue, how did that discussion go for you?
I don't see any development. Unfortunately, I don't know how to struggle with it. I see this problem. Yes, I see this problem of refugees and of Europe, and it's like a policy of contribution towards Africans from European countries after the years of colonialism. But at the same time, Ukrainian refugees appears, and Ukrainians, they are simply so unknown, something new, something bothering for Africans. They lived in the world with no Ukrainians before. Maybe it's the same way, again, just telling more about Ukrainian experience, Ukrainian, some parallels maybe between Ukrainian dissidents and dissidents in African countries during apartheid, during colonialism era. Only telling the stories. I don't see another way.
Right. I mean, one way, I suppose, to reframe it is, again, historically, which is that during the apartheid years, Black South Africans had a lot of experience as refugees. There were many Black South Africans who were in exile in the frontline states, in particular in Zambia and Tanzania and later in Zimbabwe, but also further afield in Europe and in what was then the Soviet Union. But later, since democracy in South Africa, since the early 90s, South Africa has much more experience. So this generation of South Africans have much more experience as a host to African refugees, Black African refugees, than they do as refugees themselves. So in that sense, their own experience has flipped. And now mostly the tension and the pressures in South Africa, it would seem to me, are in dealing with Africans coming down the continent into South Africa from Mozambique, especially from Zimbabwe, which is the one I know about most, but from Congo and from Somalia and elsewhere. And that we know how that plays out in South Africa, often violently in Alexandra Township and places, the sort of the anti-Makwere, as they call them, the Black African refugees, it can often turn violent. And so in that respect, South Africa has, as a nation, had experience on both sides of this particular issue, would you say?
Yes, and South Africa has a lot in common with other sides of the time of struggle. For example, world solidarity as well. And I know that some South African intellectuals, they appeal to this, that when during apartheid, the world expressed their solidarity with oppressed people. And during the war in Ukraine, it seems no solidarity from South African side to oppressed people, to Ukraine. But it's the same thing. It's because of propaganda, Russian propaganda. It doesn't. It brainwashed the brains of local people, and it's the frame, as you said. Yes, it's the frame of. Perception Russian as successors of Soviet Union, and they are right because they are successors of the country liberator, and so it's difficult to work with it.
Have you seen, I mean, have you noticed any shift? You mentioned earlier in your introduction, but have you noticed any shift in policy within the ANC leadership, and if so, what?
I didn't notice, unfortunately. If I noticed something, only in worse way, no, in better way. But society, South African society, it looks like it's. Another scene, according to some surveys, 70% of South African demand or ready to demand from their government to condemn Russian invasion, and they are ready to ask for support, even in weapon, from South Africa.
70%, 70%,
70%, yes, 70%, yes. And it's strange that government of a democratic country has different position than the people of the country. But I see a lot of shifts in the society. They are more and more interested. Even Ukrainian language, it became something like interesting. People started to study Ukrainian in Duolingo, and it's so far Ukraine from South Africa, but they are more and more interested in Ukraine. And they support, of course, because they say Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, the same way as we fought for our freedom 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
So are you doing a lot of outreach or cultural events for the public in South Africa? I mean, is that part of what you're doing insofar as you say, South Africa is a democracy, and you would hope eventually that the government itself would respond to figures like that 70%. Have you been, what kind of things have you been doing?
We are telling more about Ukraine through cultural events, yes, of course, different exhibitions. Recently, we opened the bookshelf in Cape Town Central Library, and people are interested in. People came and they ask about Ukraine. They want to read books. We can't bring a lot of books because of the distance. But we are bringing books, and our association working on it. Today, I got in Daily Maverick an article about our performance collaboration between Ukrainian choreographer and South African dancers. The performance about freedom and peace. Just to put the bridge between two cultures, between two nations, and other cultural events. Of course, it's not easy to work with state organizations, with state institutions, but grassroots organizations like Olha Desmond Tutu Foundation, for example, they support Ukraine, and they just explain what did it mean Soviet Union, and what was the price of freedom, and what is the price for South Africans, and what is the price of freedom for Ukrainian. And they repeat a lot this phrase of Desmond Tutu about being neutral. I'm rephrasing a bit. Being neutral in the position of injustice, it means being on the side of oppressor. We try to remind some episodes from history of South African freedom.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Ukrainian community in South Africa, how big it is, and when and it came, and under what circumstances?
It's quite a big, and more and more they have more and more members. We have a number of 1,000 members now, and among this community, what is interesting, South African joins this community. Not only ethnic Ukrainians, but South African are interested of joining Ukrainian community, and they learn Ukrainian on base of Ukrainian. It's like online school after COVID, but previously it was like live classes of Ukrainian language. And Ukrainian community is active in different South African cities like Durban, Pretoria, Cape Town. They are organizing protests, exhibitions, and the embassy partnering a lot with this community. It's powerful partnership, I would say.
And I wanted to ask you one more thing, just because I have the opportunity now, and I'm curious about what did you make of the visit of the president of Belarus to Zimbabwe? What was your what did you make of it, and why do you think he did it?
All these visits they are strange, starting with the airport where the presidents are met by folk dancers. It's already something strange, and this dummy of lion presented to Lukashenko, it's as well, and Lukashenko presented a personal tractor to Mnangagwa. It's as well some sort I didn't research in this question, but the picture was quite a lot strange of this friendship. It's something superficial, it seems to me, and of course it was in the time of Lavrov's visit across African countries, and it seems to me he didn't cover Zimbabwe. Probably Zimbabwe is the sphere of interest of Russian partners, Lukashenko.
So you think he did it on his own? You don't think it was done at the behest of Russia?
I think it was the same campaign.
Right. I know you've done a lot of work on refugees, and I was wondering if you'd in that regard had much to do with the very, very sizable group of Zimbabwean refugees in South Africa, many of whom are assimilated in one way or another, who've been there for many years. I wondered what your experience with them had been like.
About Zimbabwean, it's the most hard working people in South Africa. It's they are everywhere, of course, and they are not privileged, unfortunately. They are, I see them everywhere. They are doing the hardest work, and for I can say for nothing, but they are not well paid. I was sad when I got news about it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago against Zimbabwean immigrants, xenophobian movements in South Africa. It's very pity, and I would like to ask you a lot of things as well about. Yes, it's a chance of this conversation, and you know, when Oksana Mamchenkova, our coordinator, emailed me, her email caught me on reading the book about a white man or a white boy and then a white man in Zimbabwe, the history of man, by the name of author Ndlovu, probably you know. It's a black woman, Zimbabwean. She resides now in South Africa, and it was strange because the first scene and the first book I found in exclusive books was this book, not about Mugabe and not about politics, but about very different identity for Africa. And what you, with your experience, what do you think, what ways of communications with not only Ukrainian, but Western countries will be possible in future, will be fruitful in future?
The communications between
Western countries and Ukraine as part of European family, how it will develop?
You mean with Africa, the communications with Africa?
With African, sub-Saharan Africa, yes.
I mean, I do think that the shadow of colonialism is a very long one, but but I do think that as time goes on, there are fewer and fewer people who have had direct experience of living under European colonialism in Africa, and particularly French and British and Portuguese. And there are disadvantages, obviously, but there are also some advantages. For example, linguistic, and the fact that educational, and that there have been connections, and there had been post and neo-colonial aid from Europe to Africa. I think that, and mostly now, though, I see it being reframed via large and increasingly successful African communities who live in Europe. So, for example, the Zimbabwean economy, the Zimbabwean regime for that matter, would probably collapse tomorrow if it weren't for Zimbabweans sending money, who live in Britain in particular, but elsewhere, sending money back to their families in Zimbabwe, in other words, remittances, and that those remittances increasingly keep countries like Zimbabwe, they keep people from hunger, they allow people to survive, because a British pound or euro can go a very long way in Zimbabwe. And I think also it's increasingly difficult to villainize countries in Europe where a lot of your own family live and eventually start to assimilate. So in my experience, Zimbabweans who go to live in England, for example, and my mother was recently in the biggest hospital in London, and many of the staff, I mean, not a majority, but a very big minority of the staff were Black Southern Africans, nurses, doctors, radiologists, etc. So, and their children, in common with a lot of immigrants, their children start to not forget where they're from, but their Shona or Indibele isn't as good, isn't their first language. They start to assimilate. And increasingly, when they come back to Zimbabwe, that they see it not as a foreign country, but as a second home. And I think those connections start to get more and more important than government to government connections. I do think that the West in particular has a disadvantage in dealing with African governments, the African governments that are corrupt, and Zimbabwe is definitely one of them, in terms of trade and everything else, because the West tends to have conditions attached, democracy and lack of corruption and whatever, and China and Russia to some extent, but China doesn't have those conditions. So what you're really seeing, the major reframing, I think, of African international relations of this generation has been the decline in Western influence, Northwestern influence, and the increase in particular in Chinese influence. And my worry, I mean, I'm not alone in this, obviously, is that many of these Chinese deals, like the new railway line in Kenya and many others, the deals generally, they're not transparent, they're very opaque, and they have draconian conditions attached to them. In particular, if there's a default on the repayment, which unfortunately there probably will be in most cases because they're almost impossible to repay, that the Chinese get whatever the project is, it reverts to them. I mean, we've seen that in Sri Lanka, where with a big port that the Chinese built and the Sri Lankans defaulted, the Chinese basically own that whole area. So in a way, I mean, I would reframe what China's doing as a kind of new colonialism, a kind of economic colonialism. That certainly in Zimbabwe, the Chinese influence and the Chinese in mining in particular, but many other things in agriculture now is very strong. And I don't think, honestly, I don't think it's for the good. I don't think the conditions are good. I don't think the Chinese have Africa's best intentions in mind. I don't think that's what they're doing. I think what they're doing is relatively cynical. So I am worried about that. I'm also worried when I see that it's harder for Africans to get to university in Europe, because I think that traditionally has been one of the main connections when African leadership has had a chance to be at least partly educated in the West. They tend to, they tend to remember that, and I think that's lessening as well. And with Russia, it's different. I feel like the Russian economy itself is really small, compared to China. I mean, you correct me, but I think that Russian GDP is about the size of Italy's at the moment. I mean, it's not a great economic power anymore, and it's mostly a petro nation, oil-based nation. But I do think that through Wagner in particular, and what they've shown is this capacity to go and provide military backup to corrupt regimes, or even in the case of Central African Republic, just mining, diamond mining in that particular case. And they don't have any oversight, and they don't care, in terms of human rights things, who they kill or whatever. And so I think you see that in Syria, you see that in Central African Republic. I suspect you'll see that in more and more places, that actually Russian military advisors and military hardware will come in to back up, especially the authoritarian leaders in Africa will start to rely on them more and more, and that might have an outsized influence as well.
Yes, and I agree with you. And this impunity of Russia, you mentioned Syria. What since Russia did with Syrian people, and then they tried to establish with Syria some economical relationship, etc., etc. And I even can say that the same the same people who were in military operation, they were in Ukrainian sky in the very first days of our war. I think we need to move back to the topic of our conversation, dialogue on war. It was his name, Major Krasnoyartsev, and he was bombing civilians in Chernigiv. And then we discovered his biography. We realized it's the same person that worked in Syria. And what was your impression about Kiev, about Ukrainian cities in December? It was the 10th month of war, and how was it?
I mean, you know, like most people who visit Ukraine, you come away very impressed with the, you know, with the solidarity and the energy and the stoicism of Ukrainians, not just, you know, soldiers at the front, but just ordinary people getting on with their lives under difficult circumstances. I was impressed with the fact that you hardly ever hear people complain. That there really did seem, you know, morale still seemed to be high. I mean, I do think that one of the worries is that, you know, that the longer it goes on, the harder that is, you know, to keep up one's morale. And that's why I do think, you know, trips from like the one from Pen America to Pen Ukraine to, you know, are important to show Ukraine that, you know, and Ukrainians that they're not forgotten, that they haven't moved off the sort of, you know, agenda, as it were. I mean, I would draw an analogy, given that I'm a doctor's son, that, you know, when someone is, you know, in an accident or something and or has a heart attack or whatever, and is an acute position, is in the ER and whatever, everybody is around them and fixing them up and whatever. But once they come out of immediate danger, you then go into the chronic phase, and sometimes that is a different and difficult position where you realize that, yes, you're not going to die. In other words, the immediate invasion of, you know, when they tried to take Kyiv, for example, and it was they were beaten back, and now it becomes this longer term game, and one has to adjust one's, you know, national parameters, strategies for how you deal with that. And that's why I think that, you know, I mean, like everyone else, I think that obviously the Russians massively misjudged what was going to happen, and we're in a completely different situation. I do think, actually, to go to your point of this particular soldier you mentioned, I think that the work that's being done to record human rights abuses, to actually, you know, to see it as a genocide, as to see it, or rather to see it as the attacks on civilians and things, and to name and particular Russians, you know, generals and whatever involved in giving orders and things. That is also really important, and you know, we've tried to do that in various times in Africa, and I think that can have an effect going forward, because you need to feel that there will one day be an accountability, that people can't just get away with this and somehow history will forget about it. That you know, and sometimes it can seem strange to see people recording these kind of details when there are still bullets flying around, and you think, well, why? But I'm a great believer in that being important. That you know, that's something that it's what prevents these kind of things recurring, if there can be consequences to individuals for what they do.
Yes, and it seems to me my colleagues, writers in Ukraine, they are involved in some programs. They are trying to put all the details of this war on paper, on documents, to document all the circumstances, all the crimes. Even in my native city, Chernihiv, the first days, the first months of war, there were a lot of crimes against humanity when people standing in line for bread were shot. Next day, people standing in line for water were shot. A lot of these things, and what is important now, it seems to me, to tell the world about the root of this war, that it was inevitable. It was predicted by previous generations of Ukrainians, and even in my family, I have my own King's Lear story about the salt. My grandfather once called me up to the loft, and among a lot of old stuff, I found a pot, old rusty pot with a lump of salt, yellowed by time. I asked, why are you keeping this salt? And Ukrainians, they are trying to have some stock of food because of the war and famine at the beginning of previous century. And my grandfather said it would be a war with Russians. It was the beginning of the millennium. I was in my 20s, and I didn't take it seriously. What a strange prediction! But now I have reconsidered this story, and I keep coming back to this lump of salt a lot of times. How did he know this? Because he grew up in the family that went through famine in this man-made famine, because he was in Soviet army during Second World War, and he revealed me about a different situation when Russians oppressed their brothers in arms, Ukrainian, Georgian, in Soviet army, because he closely followed the news and the development of Ukrainian new Ukrainian state, independent state in the times of independence. So he analyzed all these scenes, and he kept this salt for us in case we will need a calm place to move from the big city in the times of war. So this war is not something new for us, but we didn't expect such scale of this war. We didn't expect such atrocities. And we thank, of course, we thank all our partners for solidarity, all the world. And the only thing we don't have this dialogue with global South, with these countries, and we need to work on it harder now. Not only in terms of policy, not only in terms of state strategy, but in terms of culture and cultural dialogue.
That's so true, and this is why it's so important for you when you are organizing all those literary festivals, right? And initiating, launching the projects of translation and also children books. I found out that that's funny fact from last year, London Book Fair. We had the most popular books which were stolen from our stands, like regularly on a daily basis. One was actually the children book of children's stories, and the second one was the food and culture. So probably that could be some kind of key to bring some connection, to put people together, to create this on a very horizontal level. Because as you really brought up a lot in this conversation on colonization and oppression in different contexts of refugees, which is quite painful. I think that at the very beginning, I remember we were so sure that those who have an experience of being colonized and being refugees are the first to understand. But it appeared to be more complicated. It appeared that being in a pain stops you sometimes from containing even more pain. And limited access to resources can bring us to definitely internal conflicts as well. So this is quite important, but obviously not so easy question to discuss. And this huge task we have to compile, thank you for naming this, Peter, reframing not only social context, but the whole historical background, destroying those made-up myths and this, Russian project outcomes. And we sometimes can see it from the ground. Sometimes we need this external point of view. But there's still a lot in common to share, right? Liberation struggle, perception of African nations after being colonized, and how to fight Russian propaganda in Africa. I actually have a question to you, Oksana, about that. And I have one more question to Peter to be asked later. This is a question from one of our viewers. Which are the most popular messages or myths of Russian propaganda spread there in Africa?
The most popular is that the Russians liberate our eastern territories, about Ukrainian being proxy of Western country, about Ukrainians who committing genocide on the Western Ukraine and on the Eastern Ukraine, on Donbass. And they even brought their watchers for it was like referenda, false referenda, and they brought it was recently, and they brought from South Africa representatives from pro-governmental party witnessing how Ukrainians committing crimes against Donbass, Russian-speaking Donbass. So it's we need just to tell the larger story about Russian-speaking Donbass. Why is it Russian-speaking? That rural Donbass areas are Ukrainian-speaking, and they are singing Ukrainian songs. But the cities in the period of industrializing, they were artificially populated by Russians. Soviet regime brought Russians to cities of Donbass. That is why just to strip out Ukrainian identity from these territories, but they didn't phase it out due to rural areas. So Donbass is not like Russian-speaking and not pro-Russian. We need to explain all this, but it's a large story, a long story. It consists of smaller stories. And our Ukrainian association twicely brought here to South Africa folk band Divina. Probably you know them, Olha. They are singing Ukrainian songs of Donbass. They are witnessing of Ukrainian-speaking Donbass. So this work.
I think that the main challenge that we are literally on the very big, on the very beginning of this big job to be done.
Yes.
And I think that there are two sides of this. First is governmental and embassies approach, definitely initiating some conversations, meetings, anything what we can call the culture advocacy, right? And the second is probably through the culture itself. And the second question I have, it's kind of from one of our kind of disappointed viewer who is saying, I wanted to ask Mr. Peter about his perspective, that he said that as a Ukrainian citizen, I was surprised in a negative way how some foreigners react to this war. And to my regret, I have met a lot of hate and even harassment in comments on various international news media pages, including German like Der Spiegel, Le Monde in France, and in British Economist, left by Europeans and Ukrainian immigrants living abroad. And due to them, their countries should not be so deeply engaged into the conflict by providing Ukrainians with military, with humanitarian support. And like, what is your opinion on this? And how do you actually see the situation? Where is this limit of being safe and being involved, not provoking, but still being supportive? What is your perspective?
It's a huge question. I mean, which is obviously what the West is wrestling with. I mean, my own personal view is that the Ukrainian conflict was internationalized from the beginning. That this was never a little local disagreement between neighbors. This is something that was always, as we've been discussing in historical terms, a much bigger thing. And I think that you know, it's been clear to the countries of Eastern and Central Europe from the beginning that if Russia were to prevail in the Ukraine, it probably won't stop there. This is something that, you know, the Putin vision, it would keep going, and that really what one's fighting for are things that are global. I mean, one's fighting for democracy and the self-determination of people, and these are supposed to be international. These are supposed to be international points that we agree on and we at least aspire to, and therefore we're, you know, my own particular point is that I'm obviously backing Ukraine and feel like that you know, that we need to continue to do it. And I, you know, in my experience as a foreign correspondent, you know, these conflicts, you know, if it's not in Ukraine, it's gonna keep coming. It's something that you have to draw a line, and this is where that line is drawn. I would just say to the questioner that be quite skeptical when you read from people online and in forums, you know, replying to newspaper articles and things. The Russian propaganda effort is extremely big and extremely well financed, and it gets everywhere, and a lot of it doesn't, you know, it doesn't look like who it is. I mean, there's no point in them being open about it. So a lot of the views of the kind that they were mentioning, a great many of those, I mean, not all of them, but a great many of those are not genuine. They're not really coming from just ordinary folk in the West. The Russians are extremely active, and I mean, and there are ways to show sometimes. I mean, but I think one has to educate oneself when one's looking around, especially, you know, if you are Ukrainian and you're getting, you know, it's demoralizing you. It's important to know that most of that stuff isn't real. It really isn't. And I think the most remarkable thing, I mean, one of the most remarkable things, other than the initial repulsing of the invasion by Ukraine pretty much on its own, which was sort of an extraordinary thing, I think, and galvanized the world, is how subsequently relatively united the West has managed to remain. And I think initially there was a lot of skepticism about that, but I think it even surprised the West. So in that sense, you know, Ukraine has really done a service to the world. I mean, it's been an extraordinary fight around which to unite, and I think that it certainly surprised Russia, and it even surprised the West.
Thank you for those encouraging words. So yeah, of course, especially on internet, there's not everything is true. You should be very skeptical and apply the realistic filters about things. But that It just reminded me from yesterday that we had this big march from Ukrainian to the Russian embassy, and all the traffic, even if we blocked that completely, was so encouraging and supportive. There was the only one Russian guy driving the street, and he turned on his music really loud. So the hate speech is always a way more loud than all that supportiveness and kindness. Remember about that, because to do good things, it doesn't mean to shout about them at each corner. And this can bring us to this situation when we don't really evaluate things properly. Hate speech is always more loud, but doing the regular daily work, it's something different. And if you would ask yourself, what can I do as an intellectual today? I would refer to very simple recipe shared by both of our speakers. Talk to each other and learn each other with an open mind and open heart. Create the connection, which no government can do that on behalf of you. This very personal context. And this conversation would not be possible without the support of our partners. The US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. The gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand at the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. Pan International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. Thank you again, our great speakers. There were a lot of, insights from the areas we definitely not touch into often. That was a great pleasure and great privilege having you here. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, our viewers, and please follow our announcement. We still have a few episodes for you. So spread the word and stand with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.